if you can have a good skill, if for example you have a good listening skill, then you can have good relationships with your friends. Something else is premarital counseling. This is something that we recently get more clients for. So before they start having a family, they decide to come for counseling, they decide to come to have some tests, talk about their characteristics, their similarities, their differences, and this is something very important. The other thing is family relationships issues. So I remember I had a client, and this client was in a relationship with someone from outside of the community, and that person was Shia, and they wanted to get married. But the parents emphasized that this person has to marry someone from the community. So we deal also with these kind of issues. Stress and substance abuse issues, which the last one is also something very common, and even it's very common in this community. So our counseling center is in basement of JCC, and everything is extremely confidential. We don't share names, nothing, even with our colleagues or even with the supervisor, even with the chair. So please feel free if you have any of these issues or any other issue, you can come to me or Sister Sakina, and we're always there for you. That's it. Thank you.
Just a reminder, if you guys have any questions for Sheikh Nasser, if you just follow the information on the screens, you're able to text in your questions. Just text JSS seminar to the number on the screen, and then you can text your questions in for him for the Q&A portion of the event. So our main speaker today, as you all know, is Sheikh Nasser. Sheikh Azhar Nasser was born and raised in Michigan and has a degree in cultural anthropology from the University of Michigan. After completing his academic studies, he pursued his religious studies at the Hawza of Najaf under the offices of Grand Ayatollah Sistani and Grand Ayatollah Hakim. In addition to his extensive study of classical religious texts, he has also taught introductory courses to Western students at the seminary. Sheikh Azhar has a deep passion for the studies of the Holy Quran, which is evident from his lectures and from his discussion. Sheikh Azhar is also the religious director of the CBE, an organization which specializes in the production of short, spiritually uplifting videos, and the founder of the Tasneem Institute. Please welcome the Sheikh with a loud salawat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor for me to have the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon about a topic that I really feel is becoming increasingly important. Now, when we discuss the topic of mental illness, mental health, emotional health, whatever label you want to give, the first step is that we have to actually acknowledge the importance of the topic. What's beautiful about the Holy Quran is that sometimes topics that you think are not addressed by the Quran are actually indirectly addressed by the Holy Quran. You know, you would never think that you would find an ayah in the Quran that directly or indirectly addresses the topic of mental health. But someone who has dedicated their lives to the study of the Quran will be able to extract those pearls for you. Now, when I think about the topic of mental health, and when I use the word depression, mental health, I don't want you to only think of the modern day definitions. For now, I want to just conflate grief, sadness, emotional turmoil, all of those words that are used to describe that feeling of just being overwhelmed, that internal disturbance. You know, when I think of this topic, what's interesting to me is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran speaks in a number of verses about the emotional health of the Prophet. Now, again, I don't want to say that the Prophet, suffered of, clinical depression. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that we have ayat of the Quran that were revealed for the sole purpose of comforting the Prophet. So for example, I mentioned that it's important for us to acknowledge the importance of mental, emotional health. Yes? So there's a verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Hijr. Surah Al-Hijr is surah number 15. Now if you guys want to follow along, if you have a Quran app, feel free to do so. So the verse, if someone, can someone pull up so I think it's ayah number 96 or 97. Can someone quickly look it up for me? Just so I don't get the number of the ayah wrong. So surah number 15, Surah Al-Hijr, 96, 97 roughly, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّكَ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ 97. Where Allah says, indeed, without a doubt. So Allah is addressing the Prophet. And this is a Meccan surah. So you can imagine the Prophet is dealing with unspeakable hostility. Life is very difficult. The Prophet is losing followers, right? People are getting killed. People are being driven out of their homes. All of that pressure is on him. When the Muslim community is suffering any type of loss, they look to their leader. You think you have a lot of pressure, being the oldest sibling, there's a lot of pressure on me. Rasulullah has the entire ummah on his shoulders. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, throughout the life of the Prophet is consoling him, right? Because the Prophet, sometimes we forget that he's a human being. He feels things. He gets overwhelmed. He feels grief. He feels sorrow. He gets frustrated. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّكَ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ Ya Rasulullah, we know that what they say, and they used to slander the Prophet, we know that what they say is causing your heart to feel constricted. When you're overwhelmed, you kind of feel that internal tightness. You almost feel like, it's hard to breathe. You just feel very constricted. So I think it's very beautiful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah, what does Allah do? Before Allah tells him what to do, He acknowledges that emotional turmoil. What do we do in our communities? If someone is suffering of depression, they're overwhelmed with just life, what do? We say things that make them feel that their iman is deficient, right? So we don't even acknowledge the suffering. We just say, oh no, have you read, Surah Yasin? Have you read this dua? Oh no, you need to, read Ziyarat Ashura. Now, we're not saying that, you shouldn't do those things. But even Allah has the right to say whatever He wants. But even Allah Azza wa Jal, before prescribing a plan to kind of rectify that emotional turmoil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first says, I know that it's difficult, right? That in and of itself, that means a lot. If someone is depressed, if someone is suffering, sometimes the best thing that you can do is just to acknowledge that, listen, you have it rough. I understand. Listen. Acknowledge the difficulty that they're going through. Don't dismiss it. Because if you dismiss it and you say something that makes that person feel even smaller, you just kind of give him or her, oh, just read this dua, just do this, just do that, as if it's something that's not, it's something that's trivial. You could potentially push someone over the edge, and depression may become suicide, right? It happens. So this is on the first level, that the Prophet's emotional health is important to Allah Azza wa Jal. Because the success of Islam, it doesn't only depend on how many followers the Prophet, if he has a shield, whether he's going to go into battle. How the Prophet feels, his emotional health, that inner peace is important. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals, as I mentioned in my first majlis a couple nights ago, Surah Al-Kawthar is Allah's way of consoling the Prophet. And as I mentioned, incidentally, it's the shortest surah in the Quran. If someone tells you that, I'm in a bad place, I'm depressed, what do we usually think? We overdo it, right? We think that I have to say a lot, right? Allah says, you're in a difficult place, here's Surah Al-Kawthar. 3 verses. And then I'll give you space. We have to understand, brothers and sisters, it's normal to feel sad. Sorrow, grief, these are normal human emotions. Even prophets, I mentioned an example in the Holy Prophet, even Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, he grieved. If someone was in our community and let's say that their child was kidnapped and they cried every day for 40 years, and then they became blind because of the grief, what would you say about that person? What would you say? In our community, we would probably say that Yaqub doesn't have strong iman. But he's ma'soom. He's a prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't condemn that. You see, brothers and sisters, there's a fine line between huzn, between grief and despair. Grief, it's normal. It doesn't feel good, but it's a normal human emotion. Grief does not mean that you have weak iman. Sorrow does not mean that your faith is weak. Yes, despair, that's a sin. To say that there's no way out. That's it. There's no hope. That is where the problem is. That's from shaitan. But sadness, the grief, the depression, all of that, you're lucky if you don't ever experience that. Every one of us, at one point or another in our lives, you're going to have difficult times. Ulama experienced that. Prophets. After the death of the Prophet, do you think it was easy for Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen? It's very difficult. When you lose someone like Fatimah al-Zahra, alayhi salatu wassalam, you lost your spiritual match, your spiritual equal. We have traditions that say that when, they used to be able to they were each other's emotional shelter. After the death of Lady Fatima alayhi salam, the Imam had no one to share his grief with. And I think that's an aspect of the life of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib that we tend to ignore. Because we always think of Ali ibn Abi Talib as the fearless warrior. But the Imam cried. He used to go out in the middle of the desert and just pour out the emotions. He used to do that with Lady Fatima, but now he doesn't have anyone who can listen. When Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam lost her father, she grieved. She cried so much that the neighbors, the residents of Medina, started to complain. What does the Imam alayhi salam do? Does he tell her, have sabr, stop crying? He actually builds a place for her. That is support. He doesn't shun her. He actually builds a place. If you can't cry and mourn at home and grieve, he builds a structure for her called Baytul Ahzan, the house of sorrow. A place where you can go, there's no judgment, you let it out. So you see that in the Quran, in the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt, there's precedent for this. But the problem is, most people have a very elementary understanding of their religion. They think everything's just black and white. They've reduced Islam to just a set of rituals. There's no depth. There's no depth. So these are certain things that we have to keep in mind. And as a final comment, and inshallah we'll open up the floor for Q&A. What I think is a solution, and again, I'm not a subject expert, so I always preface any advice I get by admitting that this is not my field of expertise. So you have to, just like you refer to a marji' when you have a fiqhi question, if you're having mental health problems, if you're having some, emotional problems, you also need to refer to an expert. Why is it that when it's religion, you refer to the expert, but anything else, it's like mental health, we don't want to refer to experts. How often do you guys go to the dentist? Or let me rephrase this. How often should you go to the dentist? That wasn't a rhetorical question. Every 6 months, right? Even if you have good teeth, right? So if you don't have any cavities and you brush and you floss, why do you still go every 6 months? Sisters, why do you still go? Sisters are so shy. There's a lot of haya on this side, which is good, I guess. You go, why? Because it's about prevention, right? Why don't we have the same? So that's how we deal with our dental hygiene, right? What's the problem if every few months you go and you talk to a counselor and you get a mental checkup, right? See, the problem with our community is that the moment anyone finds out that you spoke to a therapist or you spoke to a counselor, everyone thinks that you're disturbed, right? And if you're young, if you're a young lady, the prospects of you getting married, right? They go down. Same thing for the brothers. So there's a stigmatism attached to it. But there's nothing wrong with it, really. Now, people often say, but the counselor is not Muslim. So is your doctor Muslim? Does your dentist have to be? How about your pharmacist? Why is it that the religion of the counselor, why does it matter so much? Because if you go to a counselor and you make it clear to them what you want to achieve, I feel bad, I just want to get myself out of this, I want to identify what's causing this depression, what can I change to start to feel better? They usually allow you to guide the conversation, right? Now, granted, if there's someone that's really young, like 15, 16 years old, I think they need a bit of supervision, because when you're young, you're very impressionable, right? You might be, dealing with a counselor that, may mistakenly identify something in your religion that's causing you the depression. But typically, when you're a bit older, you're pretty smart. You can tell them that my faith is very important to me, and if you make it clear to them, they're not going to touch that area of your life. They're not going to tell you that, maybe, I think if you leave Islam, you'll feel a lot better. They're not going to say that. So I really think that one of the ways that we can prevent mental illness is if we start to normalize the practice of getting a mental checkup every once in a while. You check your teeth every 6 months. Why don't you make sure that you're emotionally balanced? Like, why is it that it has to get to the point where I feel suicidal? That's when the community wants to start doing something. That's not a good plan. So we have to talk about prevention. And that's my 2 cents on the topic. And maybe you guys have other suggestions. The brother was indicating to me that the community also has a helpline for those who are having some issues. So again, these are steps in the right direction. But I think there has to be a paradigm shift. We have to stop associating depression with weak iman, weak faith. We have to stop thinking that just because someone goes to a therapist or a counselor, that means they've lost their minds. That's not true. And it's unfair to kind of pass that type of judgment, because subhanallah, people who are like that, who judge others, Allah has a way of kind of serving poetic justice, right? You mistreat, you make other people feel small because they're emotionally, in a bad place. It might happen to your kids, it might happen to, your loved ones. So you have to be, sympathetic. You have to develop a bit of empathy. So that's my 2 cents, and inshallah we'll open up the floor. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So just a quick note, the photographer is going to be on both sides of the floor today. And also another reminder for this Q&A session, if you do have any questions, there should be the information on the slides on the screens, but you can text JSS Seminar to the number 36707. So JSS Seminar 337. Text that to 37607, and then you can text your questions to the Sheikh, and we will read them out. So the first question that we've received, does Islam say anything about sexual abuse? And just a reminder as well to everybody here that there is a program on Thursday covering this topic more in depth for sexually abused women and children. So attend that program to get more information about this. But to pose that question to the Sheikh, does Islam say anything about sexual abuse?
When we speak about the topic of sexual abuse, it's a very general topic. In order to kind of give an answer. Now, as a rule of thumb, any type of abuse is forbidden in Islam. Whether it's sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. Islam is a religion that wants to eradicate abuse in all forms. Now, when it comes to sexual abuse, unfortunately, this happens in every religious community, right? I think it would be naive to say that it doesn't happen in Muslim communities, that it doesn't happen at the mosque. It happens. We have to be real. These things do happen. Now, sometimes, when an incident of sexual abuse takes place, what usually happens is that the community, especially if it happens in a community, there's an attempt to kind of keep it hush-hush, right? Especially if it's a prominent community member. You know, the reality, my dear brothers and sisters, is that, you know, sometimes people who are in positions of power exploit that authority. And again, there are people that are sick. There are sick people everywhere. It's not just, you know, you don't have to go to Vegas to run into weird people. It's sick people. Sometimes, you know, there were people who surrounded Rasulullah who were, you know, potentially deranged. They had some major issues. So, as I mentioned, when this type of thing happens, there's usually an attempt to kind of just, you know, cover it up, resolve it in a very quiet fashion. Because the argument is usually, you know, we want to kind of protect the reputation of the community. If people find out, they might be discouraged to come. They might not ever come to the center. And what happens is what? The victim becomes secondary, right? So I think that there needs to be a very firm stand. Now, I will say that in Islam, when an accusation of that magnitude is put forward, there has to be evidence. There has to be, you know, clear-cut evidence. Because, you know, this is something that could rip apart a community. So it's not enough to say, that, you know, oh, this person did this, because there are certain requirements, that there's a certain level of evidence that has to be produced to permit the enforcement of punishment. Now, even if that's not doable, you know, a victim knows that it happened. What you can do is that, you know, you need to reach out to someone who can ensure that that never happens again. Get you the help that you need, because I would imagine that if you were a victim of sexual abuse, you know, the crime has been committed, but the damage, you know, it might even last a lifetime. So I think that there needs to be some counseling, you know, that takes place if that type of incident, you know, does happen. Furthermore, even if we don't have clear-cut evidence that someone has committed, you know, sometimes just the suspicion can warrant caution, right? You know, you're very rarely going to have a situation where you have two just witnesses who were there and saw a sexual crime being committed. It doesn't need to get that point for us to take action. You know, if there are certain indicators of devious behavior, I think that there needs to be some measures to potentially, you know, have, you know, people keep an eye on things, be vigilant. You know, if there needs to be, you know, cameras installed at our centers, that's also a measure that we can take. So these are things that, you know, we have to keep in mind, you know, whenever, you know, there is an incident of sexual abuse. And because it's such a general topic, you know, I'm not able to cover all aspects, but just, you know, something to think about.
Another question that we got, what is the Islamic difference? Is there a difference in Islam between clinical depression versus feeling low and feeling down?
Now, as I mentioned, the Quran uses a number of words to describe, you know, what we would call, you know, depression, you know, that feeling of, you know, that emotional turmoil. So there's the word huzn that's used in the Quran, grief. And that's what Yaqub alayhi salam experienced. وَبِيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. When Allah speaks to the Prophet, He mentions the word ضِيق. وَلَقَدْ نَعْلَمُ أَنَّكَ يَضِيقُ صَدْرُكَ بِمَا يَقُولُونَ. That, you know, that constriction in the heart. The word hem is used. Just the burden. So there are a number of words that are used in the Quran, and you find that they're used in reference to holy personalities. Now, as I mentioned, the problem is when that grief, that sorrow, that depression, whatever you want to call that, when it becomes yes. Yes means despair. And that is a very dangerous place to be mentally. Because for someone to commit suicide, we're not talking about grief anymore. We're not talking about huzn. We're not talking about dhiq. We're talking about yes. There's anyone who commits suicide, it's because they got to a point of hopelessness. They felt that this is the only way. So that seems to be, at least from my humble understanding, that seems to be a distinction that is made, where the yes, this despair, this hopelessness is a sin, but anything before that is not a sin, but it's something that, you don't want to be in grief forever. You don't want to have that dhiq, as the Quran says, forever. Allah has prescribed certain things that can help. But if you determine that what you feel is actually, for example, a chemical imbalance, in addition to the dua and the prayers, you might also need medication. So you shouldn't treat Quran and the ahadith as the only prescription. In the same way, dua is not the only answer to your problems. You recite dua and you also put in effort. So in addition to dua and prayer, there needs to be that effort where you actually go and you reach out to a counselor, talk to a therapist, a psychologist, whoever you want to reach out to. That is your harakah, right? That is the human effort that needs to be there. As Allah says, "Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim." Allah's not going to change your condition unless you're proactive. Now, this is a general verse, so this can be applied to a number of areas in our lives. And I think, mental illness, the spirit of this verse speaks to the need for being proactive and not just relying on religious rituals as the end-all be-all for all of the problems that we're having. Dua is part of the solution, there's no doubt, but it's not the only solution. You need something else, especially, when you're talking about an actual mental illness.
You mentioned this earlier, that there's a lot of stigma around mental health and depression as an ailment. How do we, especially as youth, how do we begin to take away that stigma and break down the barriers that prevent us from having the conversation?
It's definitely going to take time. Things are not going to change overnight. But, I think what we're doing now is, hopefully changing people's views of, what it means to suffer of a mental illness, what should be done. So I think if we have programs like this, that helps. How many people are in this room right now? 50 maybe? 50 more or less, give or take. Each and every one of us, we have a social network, right? We have friends, we have families. So now that you have this information, you can kind of create ripples, right? If you have a friend, you can kind of make that recommendation. So even though there are only a few people in this room, you guys all have siblings, you have cousins, you have friends. You might be that light in someone's life that gives them a little bit of hope. Because, truth be told, everybody else seems to just, it's all doom and gloom. That's all they hear from everybody else. They're made to feel inadequate. So this information, this knowledge that you have now, that the Quran has at least implicit references to emotional health. Now, you have some knowledge. You're equipped with a weapon. Because there are some religious folks who just don't make these connections, right? They live in a very black and white world. They're not able to kind of, read the Quran with this depth and come to these types of conclusions. So now that you have this knowledge, you can start having an impact within your own circles.
So there's another question that we got in. What do you do if somebody you know refuses to seek help from mental health issues?
Not everyone who's suffering of a mental illness has reached a point where they've become a danger to themselves. And sometimes it's difficult to tell where someone is, right? You'd be surprised. Sometimes the happiest, the most outgoing people are actually the ones who are suffering the most. Behind the smile, there's a bleeding heart, right? Some people are very good at hiding it. Do you guys remember, what's his name? Robin Williams? The actor Robin Williams. If you were to ask me, I would have thought this guy's the happiest guy in the world. He's a comedian. Seems like he has a pretty good life. At least in our mind, out of nowhere, he commits suicide. So sometimes people that you think they just have an amazing life, they're laughing, they're sociable. You don't know. You don't know what happens behind closed doors, what people are going through. You don't know what's behind the smile. So if you know that someone is in a very dark place and you're concerned that they might, cross over into the realm of despair, you do have a responsibility to kind of, reach out to someone who can kind of intervene. But if they're still trying to work it out, if they're at the beginning stages where they're kind of in a slump, perhaps it's not time yet for you to intervene, right? Because if you intervene too early, that person might shut you out of their lives forever. So you have to, just as I mentioned, sometimes you got to give people space, So again, it's not easy, So you do your best, and that's why sometimes instead of talking, you got to be a better listener. You got to look for certain cues. And maybe you need to do research online. What are signs that someone is suicidal? So make sure you have that information so when you do see the signs, you can take action as opposed to just sitting back and letting something very unfortunate, transpire.
As youth, sometimes the cause of mental health and depression can be from people close to you at home and within your own family. So how do you manage that, and how do you get people, especially in your family, to take the issue of mental health and depression seriously, and to help youth who won't have access to resources? How do you get your family to help you out with that?
I think we have to acknowledge that some people have it pretty rough. You guys are familiar with Surah Al-Lahab, Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabin wa Tab? Don't you think it's interesting that out of all of the Prophet's enemies, he's mentioned by name in the Quran? Like what happened to Abu Sufyan? Abu Jahl. Why Abu Lahab? Why Abu Lahab? Any guesses? Because he's the Prophet's uncle. When Abu Jahl insults the Prophet, it hurts. When Abu Sufyan insults the Prophet, it hurts. But it's another level of pain when it comes from a family member. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or at least maybe one of the reasons why He's mentioned by name. Because when you're abused by family, it hurts on another level. And this is what the Prophet went through. So subhanAllah, when you read the Prophet's life, the seerah of the Prophet really becomes like a source of therapy in and of itself. Because the Prophet was an orphan. He experienced poverty. His wife died. His children died. Are you an immigrant? The Rasulullah had to leave his home. He was displaced. He had to fight in war. He had marital problems. Some of his wives were not good to him. So almost every scenario, every human experience is seen in his life. And also the example of what? An abusive family member in the form of Abu Lahab. Now, sometimes that's just not going to change. The reality is, in an ideal world, it'd be nice to be able to change everybody and have, all family members support you and be there for you. But, this is dunya. We're not living in Jannah. Really, that's the sad reality. So if you're not getting the support at home from anyone, you have to find it somewhere else. Find it with maybe a relative, a friend. And sometimes the emotional support that you get from someone that's not a part of your family is actually, you get even more from someone who's an outsider. A lot of times people prefer to get that support from someone who's not in there because there's no judgment, right? So if you're not getting the support at home, you have to find it somewhere else. In the same way that when the Prophet wasn't getting support from his own family members, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opened up doors. You have someone like, someone like Salman, he's not even an Arab. And he was a huge support to the Prophet. Now, even though with this example, I'm not talking about, mental health, but the point is, you have to find that support. Make dua, find that support, try to, sometimes you gotta chip away. It may take years for someone to change their perception of, mental illness. But you chip away, and hopefully gradually people will have a change of heart. But if you're not finding that help at home, you have to find it somewhere else. But always try to seek that help from someone that you find to be trustworthy, someone who actually knows what they're talking about. So whether that person is within the family or outside the family, you kind of have to assess your situation.
Okay, another question that we've received. What do we do if we find ourselves contemplating self-harm as an escape from depression?
So it really depends on what the question is asking. Like, when you say self-harm, are we talking about cutting?
I feel like, yeah, any sort of like physical self-harm.
You see, brothers and sisters, a lot of times self-harm is a cry for help, right? It's a cry for help in many cases, because we know a lot of people in our own lives where they're engaging in self-harm, but they haven't committed suicide yet. So what's keeping them from committing suicide? God forbid. When they're cutting themselves, again, I'm not an expert, I'm just thinking out loud. And perhaps maybe some sisters, some brothers can contribute to the conversation. If someone's cutting themselves, they're engaging in self-harm, and they haven't committed suicide, at least from my perspective, they still have hope that someone will see that is their cry for help. So is the question, is the person talking about himself or another individual?
It was left fairly ambiguous. Just
So
self-harming
if it's you, if that is your cry for help, try to actually seek help. You don't need to hurt yourself to get the message across. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is just, listen, I'm human. I've had a very rough life, and this is my way. This is what I was doing as my cry for help, but I'm tired. I just need someone to be there for me, someone to kind of pull me out of this misery. So stop harming yourself. I know it's easier said than done, but if that's a cry for help, actually seek the help. Don't let shaitan convince you that that's it, there's no more hope. Because even Iblis, his name literally means the one who has lost hope, right? And he wants you to be hopeless. So don't fall into that trap. It's okay to feel down, it's okay to feel grief and sorrow, but you have to be courageous enough to reach out for help, right? And if it's someone else, if you can't help them, as Rasulullah says, "Ad-dallu ala al-khayr kafa'ile." If you can't help that person, then at least direct them to someone who can help them. The problem is, sometimes you see someone in the community, that they're not well, and you say, I'm not a therapist, and you just move on. No, you failed in your responsibility. Yeah, you can't help them, but you can't find someone that can help them. You can't be careless. We always talk about, rahmah, having mercy, having compassion. This was an opportunity for you to have mercy, and you just completely turn your back on another human being. What if that was you? How would that feel? Where you're crying for help, and then someone says, I'm not a therapist, I can't help you. It's not a good feeling. So if you can't help them directly, at least guide them to someone who can offer them that help.
Sorry, just on that note, there were contact information for both the Jafri Support Services helpline numbers on the screen, and it will be on the screen throughout the program. There's the Nasiha Muslim Youth helpline, where you can ask questions. You can call them or email them or go to their website, and you can ask questions and you can talk to people, and it's all completely confidential. And we also have Sister Sabah, who's sitting at the back, so if afterwards you have any questions or you just want to get her card or contact her in any way, her contact information's on the screen, and you can go see her at the back as well. We got another question. The question is, what should we say when we are told by older generations that depression didn't exist in their time and that there's no need for medical attention or otherwise? It can be a taboo subject. One of the questions also mentioned that people in the older generations joke about it just being stress. So how do you convey that it is a real issue?
For someone to say, again, we have to define our terms, right? For someone to make a statement like that and say that depression, didn't exist in our time, not only is that an ignorant thing to say, that almost makes me wonder, and you should never say this to an elder. We always have to maintain that akhlaq. But it really makes me wonder, how detached, how warped is your view of the world? Like, you must be living on Mars to make a statement like that. For someone to insinuate that, there's no depression during my time. Yeah, maybe you were living in a bubble. Maybe you were one of the people that was just so careless and so out of touch and so insensitive that you never noticed that the person right next to you was suffering. So, the problem is when you're talking to someone who's in their 50s, 60s, 70s, it's difficult to change their views. They're pretty set in their ways. So sometimes you have to pick your battles. Is it really worth expending all of that energy to change the mind of someone who's 60 years old? Especially if, to make a comment like that. I mean, if I heard that, I would probably start laughing. Just because it's so egregious that there's no other way to respond but just to laugh. Like, okay, sure, it didn't exist. I mean, what are you gonna do? So, yeah, I would say just you have to pick your battles. I mean, this person clearly, I don't know what Quran they're reading, because I see verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to lift the Prophet's spirits. What's Baytul Ahzan? It really raises more questions. So, unfortunately, we have hope that, the new generation is a bit more sensitive, and they don't make sweeping comments like that are based on no evidence, by the way. It's easy to make a claim, so what's your dalil for that? So explain this ayah, explain this historical incident. How about, the oceans of, scientific research that we have? Are we just gonna completely, this is a deen of logic. This is an evidence-based religion. Are we just gonna throw all that out the window?
Another question we got in. What can you do to move on from sexual abuse trauma? How do you heal after an event like that?
I really don't have the answer to that question, because in order for anyone to give you a step-by-step guide, they have to be experts. So this is an example of an area. If someone came to me, people have the impression that if you wear imamah, you have all the answers. But we don't. Everyone specializes in their field. So I would say that, just like you come to me when you have a question about fiqh or aqa'id or whatever, that this is beyond the scope of my expertise. You need to talk to someone who specializes. You have to seek a subject expert.
After undergoing trauma or after undergoing hard times and hardship, how do you refrain from blaming yourself? How do you stop that sort of circle where you get into a depressive state because you feel like you were the cause of whatever it was that happened? How do you prevent that and stop that?
I think you have to remind yourself, especially if you're a victim, you got to remind yourself that it's not helping, right? What are you benefiting? Like the blame. The blame game is not going to get you anywhere. So you have to really have the mindset that I want to get better. And blaming myself is not part of the solution. So I just need to train myself that whenever that thought passes my mind, I don't entertain that thought. It's really helpful. This is something that I was told by a psychologist, that sometimes it helps to envision thoughts as vehicles that are passing by, right? And sometimes you don't have control over the thoughts that cross your mind, but you do have control over giving that thought attention, right? So you have all of these thoughts, they're passing by, some of them are negative, some of them are positive. Have you guys played the game Frog? Maybe I'm too old school. It was an old game where cars are passing and the frog has to crawl. Well, I am old, I guess. So anyway, you have all these thoughts. Only get into the vehicle that represents a positive thought. right? So if you're having negative thoughts, just let them pass by. Positive thought comes across your mind, give that attention. And it takes training. There are even YouTube videos about, training yourself to be positive and just not engaging. Don't give those negative thoughts attention, because what you focus on is amplified. So just because a thought crosses your mind, don't amplify it by focusing so much on it. Just give attention to things that are going to make you better, things that are going to facilitate your recovery.
So some more questions have come in. Sometimes when a youth is told that we are suffering mentally and emotionally, it is because we don't pray or have strong faith. Is that true, and how do we go about that argument?
I think that it's undeniable that faith does play a role in our emotional health. There's research to back this up. People of faith live longer lives. They have higher levels of happiness. Even the Quran says, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبِ, that verily through the remembrance of God, the hearts are tranquil. But that doesn't mean, as I said, that doesn't mean that faith alone is going to protect you from any emotional turmoil. Iman is necessary for inner peace. But no one can say that Iman alone, you don't need anything else, is sufficient for inner peace. You see, there's a difference. So, someone who doesn't have Iman, I would say, is very susceptible to that imbalance. You're not going to have that itmi'nan. Right? And we see it all the time. People, they have everything, but they're miserable. It's because they're missing that component. They're missing the relationship with Allah. But just because you have faith, it doesn't mean that I don't need to see any counselor, I don't need to take any medication. That's also not true. There needs to be a balance. So definitely faith, dhikr, religiosity, these things do impact your mental health. But again, you're going to need more than that to maintain it.
So the LGBT community is growing and affecting our youth, leading to a crisis in self-identity. How do we deal with that, and how do we navigate the LGBT issue in a world where it is so widely accepted and promoted?
There's a lot of mu'ammameen that got in trouble because of questions like this, but I'll answer it. Now, when it comes to the topic of homosexuality, what we first have to understand, number one, we Muslims believe that Allah is just, that Allah is merciful. Sometimes before you get into these controversial topics, you have to always have, these intellectual bunkers that you always go back to, right? Allah is just, He's merciful. He doesn't punish for things that you don't have control over. Now, with that said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed certain things in the Holy Quran. And there's no doubt that homosexuality is not a lifestyle that is compatible with the Holy Quran. It's not compatible with the Islamic tradition. Now, so the question is, people ask, so what if I'm attracted to the same gender? Because I'll tell you what, brothers and sisters, I've met people who've come to me, and when I talk to them, it doesn't seem like it's a choice for them. Because, they're crying. They're telling me that I don't want to be like this. But this is how I feel. Now, I don't think it's helpful And I don't even think it's necessary to get into the whole nature versus nurture debate. I really don't think it's even necessary. Because at the end of the day, brothers and sisters, heterosexuals and homosexuals, everybody has desires. Whether that desire comes from something in your genetic code or it's a result of your environment, there are certain desires that both heterosexuals and homosexuals can't act on. Having a desire is not licensed, doesn't warrant the green light to act on it. So I'll give you a very simple example. If someone, we'll speak about someone who's heterosexual. If someone wants to get married to a non-Muslim, say there's a brother, he meets a Buddhist, and they're totally compatible. You know, they went to class together, right? You know, they're vibing on all levels, right? There's an attraction. He desires her. Can he act on that desire? Can he, in the Islamic tradition, can he marry someone of the Buddhist tradition? No, it's not Ahlul Kitab. You can't. But I have the desire. So what? You have the desire. You have to suppress it. Because acting on that desire is damaging to your soul. So this is an example of a heterosexual having to restrain desire. The same thing goes for someone who is homosexual. Now, you may have this attraction. If that attraction is beyond your control, Allah doesn't punish you for things that are beyond your control. But if you take it a step further and you act on it, that's where it's problematic. You have to suppress it. Now you may say though, but there's no outlet. You know, a heterosexual, okay, he might not be able to marry the Buddhist girl. He might find someone else. There's an outlet for that sexual desire. So a homosexual might say that there's no outlet. I have a desire that's not going to be fulfilled. Welcome to dunya, right? Did Allah promise that in this life all of your desires are going to be met? We all have desires. We all have desires. So for us to have this expectation that every time I have a desire, I have a green light to act on it and fulfill that desire. Where did that concept come from? So in the same way, because at the end of the day, brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is best for you. You might not feel it at the moment. You may not understand it. You might not know the wisdom. But everything that Allah tells you is prohibited, there's a reason why He prohibited it. Even if all of the research says there's no harm. Yeah, the makhlooq is telling you that there's no harm. Created beings are telling you there's no harm. But the Creator, the one who knows the nature of the human being, the one who knows what is going to have a negative impact on the soul, He says this is not a lifestyle you are permitted to engage in. So, now what I would add to that is that if someone is a homosexual, and let's say they you know, as far as you know, they're not acting on it, you don't have the right to mistreat them. You know, many people think that, you know what's interesting to me? So, homosexuality is a sin in Islam, yes? So is not waking up for Fajr. There are a lot of sins. Why is it that when it comes to that sin, you feel like you have the right to abuse that person? I mean, do we have like a hierarchy of sins? Does the Quran say this is the worst sin? If you see this sin, yeah, you could just bash that person. Ghiba. Ghiba is one of the kaba'ir, backbiting. Everybody seems to be okay with that. So, what's interesting, I mentioned this, a couple of nights ago. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even give Musa the right to use abusive language with Fir'aun. Who's Fir'aun? You want to know his resume? He thinks he's God. So, right off the bat, you're talking to a difficult guy. He thinks he's God. He massacres people. He's a mass murderer. He's enslaved Bani Israel. You know how in our communities we respect Sada, Sayyids? Bani Israel, they're the children of who? They're the children of Yaqub. They're the children of a prophet. They're like the ancient Sayyids, enslaved. He wanted to kill Musa. Your life is literally in danger. Allah still says, speak to him with kind words. Now that doesn't mean that you endorse. Sometimes we don't strike the balance. When I say you should treat them with respect, it doesn't mean that you start wearing rainbow shirts and you start participating in their parades and you say, it doesn't mean that you endorse that lifestyle. You stick to your principles, but at the same time, as a human being, we're not going to abuse you. But if you want to know what Islam says, this is not a lifestyle that's compatible. We all have desires. I have to suppress some of my desires, and you do too. The only place where all desires will be fulfilled is Jannah. That's Jannah. But here, there are limitations. And it's not easy, right? I think we also have to acknowledge that if someone feels that way, don't belittle that struggle. That's a struggle. Everyone has their own jihad. Everyone has their struggle. For you, it might be money. You like to cut corners and make money by any means necessary. For someone else, it might be hijab. That's your struggle. Waking up for doing your prayers regularly. That's your struggle. And for someone else, that might be their struggle. So you gotta respect people's journeys, right? But that doesn't mean that we say, just because you have that desire, you can act on it. No. Where did that come from? So there are certain desires that can be channeled within the boundaries of the Sharia, and there are other desires that, for example, if you're married to a woman, Islam allows a man to marry more than one woman. Now, I would never recommend that, because you might get murdered, right? If a man is married to a woman, it's haram for him to marry the sister, right? Right, the sister's making a face like, why would you want that? That's weird, right? But let's just imagine there's a scenario where there's a man, he says, such a beautiful family. I want to marry her and her sister, right? He's greedy. He was like, I want the whole family. Is he allowed to? Is he allowed to? He's not. You can't be married to two sisters at the same time. I saw her, I married the first one, then I discovered there's a second one. I want to be married to both. I have that desire. I'm drawn. Can you act on that desire? You have to suppress it. So the point that I'm trying to make is that having a desire does not give you license to act on it. Sometimes, there are prohibitions in place. You can't act on it. And there are other cases where there are channels. There's a way for you to kind of fulfill that desire in a way that Allah has deemed lawful.
One of the questions that we got in, you mentioned that there's a difference between despair and grief, and that despair is the sin and it's when you have lost hope. How does one prevent themselves from reaching that point of despair from grief? And how do you help others around you that you fear might be headed in the direction of despair.
The best remedy for despair is to always remember that Allah is more merciful than you can comprehend. You know, if you can think of the most kind, compassionate person, you know, if you think of the relationship a mother has with her children, you know, and that's the first relationship that comes to mind when you think of pure, unconditional love. Allah put that rahmah in the heart of the mother. You know, there's a hadith from the Prophet where he says, Allah's mercy consists of 100 parts. He's trying to illustrate the vastness of God's mercy. One of them, one part of that 100, so 1%, was distributed among all creation in this dunya. So the love that you see between a mother and a child, all the love and the compassion that you see among creatures, the animals, the birds, all of that is just one part of that rahmah. You may say, well, what happened to the 99? The Holy Prophet says, and he reserved 99 parts to show mercy to his servants on the day of judgment. So it's important, you know, this is why every surah begins with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a constant reminder that no matter how many mistakes you make, that gate is always open. And it's also helpful to remember the hadith that's attributed to the Prophet where he says, لِكُلِّ دَاءٍ دَوَاءٍ. Every illness has a cure. Every problem has a solution. So I think if you're mindful of those two realities, the vast mercy of Allah and the prophetic tradition that says, you know, every disease, every illness has a cure, every problem has a solution, hopefully that, and also being around positive people, right? You have to pay attention, you know, to who you hang around with. Because there are people, you know, they're all doom and gloom, right? Their favorite story is, you know, what Munkar and Nakir are going to do to you in the grave, right? Not that you shouldn't know that, but there are some people that everything is just depressing. So associate with positive, optimistic people, you know, so that will also have an impact on your mental state.
Another question that we got in, as well as the Quran, is there any literature that you have studied or know of that would be helpful on this topic of mental health and depression?
On the topic of mental health?
Yeah, is there any other literature as well as the Quran that we can turn to?
You know, I'll tell you from my personal experience, because, you know, we all have ups and downs in life. I can't refer you to a scholarly work on mental health, you know, something that's written by a scholar and, you know, a psychologist. I'm not familiar with that type of literature. I don't know if it exists. But I do know that in addition to the Holy Quran, I find the Sahifa Sajjadiyya to be incredibly therapeutic. Like if you look at the 15 whispered prayers of Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, there seems to be like a dua for any mood that you're in, right? Because, you know, the heart changes, right? There are some days where you feel hopeful, other days where you kind of feel anxious. You know, so the Imam in these 15 whispered prayers, he kind of takes you on a journey that if you're feeling like this, recite this dua. You know, if you're feeling gratitude, munajatu shakirin. If you're fearful about the future, you know, you're in uncertain times, munajatul khaifin, the whispered prayers of the fearful. So that would be my recommendation. Just, you know, make that a part of your routine. You know, you don't need to recite it every day, you know, but maybe once a week, just to kind of gauge, you know, how you feel and kind of read the dua that corresponds with your emotions on that day.
Another question that we got in, and then after this question, if there's anybody else that has questions on the floor, we can pass you the mic. The last question here is, it is said that Allah only gives you what you can handle. But what happens when you feel like you can't handle the trials He's given you?
So I think the person that asked the question actually gave the answer. If Allah gives you and puts you through a trial, that's an indication that He's given you the fortitude to come out of that hardship triumphant. Now, when you say, oh, but you think that you can't do it, that it's overwhelming, that thought is shaitan. That's waswasa right there. So whenever you're going through a hardship, and the more difficult the hardship, you should consider that a divine compliment, right? That means that you've elevated yourself to a level where you can handle difficult hardships. So the moment you start to feel like I can't handle this, you got to block that thought out, because that's al-waswas al-khannas. That's shaitan trying to push you towards despair. So I think just being aware that there's a battle, there's an internal battle going on between you and shaitan, I think that will kind of give you the resolve that you need, the strength that you need to just kind of block that thought and remind yourself that Allah is adil, He's just, He's merciful. He wouldn't put me through this if it's impossible for me to get myself out. Now, there are going to be days where it's going to feel overwhelming, but there's a difference between feeling overwhelmed and just thinking that I can't get through this. So when that thought crosses your mind, say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, because that's a satanic thought.
So if there's anybody that has any questions and wants to ask the Sheikh, we have a few minutes left just to open it up. Question in the back?
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. So the question is, if, for example, when you are counseling someone and it's something that's not in line with Islam, like, for example, transgender, homosexuality, or drugs is a harm reduction rather than abstaining from it. So how do you go about it? Like when you are counseling or talking to someone who is doing or is involved in such things?
Now, I'm assuming that the patient is Muslim?
If it's not a Muslim, or like if it's Muslim, then what do you do? And if it's not a Muslim, then what?
So, one example that you mentioned, so if someone is addicted to drugs, there's the approach where you kind of wean them off, and then there's what they call the cold turkey, kind of just cut it off immediately. I would argue what's un-Islamic in weaning them off? You know what I mean? Like, because at the end of the day, Allah did the same thing with the Meccans. Allah didn't just say alcohol is now forbidden. It was a gradual weaning off. Don't approach salah if you're in a state of intoxication. So for that example, I don't see any religious problem. Some patients might be able to just stop, and others, and sometimes it may be dangerous to completely cut them off. They can have severe withdrawal that could potentially endanger their lives. So I don't see weaning them off as religiously problematic. And so can you give me maybe another example of... So for example, if you have someone who, for lack of a better example, someone who's homosexual. If you're a Muslim counselor, you're not allowed to tell them that, go find this partner, go, have a relationship with this partner. I would keep it very general. Find someone, without specifying that this person is of the same gender, find someone who's going to give you that emotional support. So it's not that you're encouraging sin. So whatever conclusions they come to, that's between them and God. That's up to them. But giving them general guidelines on how to recover, there's no problem with that. Is that clear?
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, how do you seek help if everyone around you has this stigma, especially family? Because I feel like family is the one who's supposed to support you, and if they don't support you in how you feel or your decisions, or even if you ask for help, what are you supposed to do?
Now, so if I may ask, this person, are they very young where, are they going to need a ride? Or are they independent enough to kind of...
No, they definitely need a ride.
They need a ride?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very difficult because...
Like mid-teens kind of area.
Mid-teens? Your parents, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them a certain degree of authority. But, that authority ends if the child is in danger and the parents are not willing to do anything about it. So, my recommendation would be, when it comes to someone that's very young, maybe have someone who's respected by the parents to kind of, have a conversation with them and potentially convince them to take action. If we're talking about someone who's a little bit older, I would say you can take that into your own hands. You don't need permission to get help from a counselor. You don't need that permission. But if someone is young, that's difficult. That's challenging. But as I said, one approach to take is find a friend, someone, a prominent community member, to kind of intervene, just to kind of convince the parents that this is something that needs to happen. It's reached a point where it cannot be ignored anymore.
What about the teens who feel that they don't want to lose their parents' respect or to have them being seen in a different way because they're actually going to seek that help, especially for old-fashioned parents?
Now, as I mentioned, none of us like to do anything behind our parents' back, right? It's not a good feeling. But at the same time, sometimes it's necessary, right? What are you supposed to do? What's the backup plan? Just, implode? Or even word, explode? So, in certain scenarios, you need to even get that help, even if it's not with their blessing. Because the alternative is dangerous and potentially lethal. So, yeah, your parents might not be happy with you if you're seeking that help. But I would also, when people are, teenagers, they do need some guidance, especially if they're going to, a non-Muslim counselor, and their faith is weak. They might be misguided in the sense that that counselor, especially if it's someone that's not very qualified, they may tell you to kind of engage in behavior that's not consistent with Islamic teachings. So there needs to be someone who's kind of monitoring and giving you some guidance. If it's not your parents, then it needs to be someone. It needs to be the Ja'fari Center, right? It's epic plug-in, right? So yeah, that is a good example. So Islamically, you're not required to get permission from your parents. If you need to go to a doctor, you need to go to a doctor. So if they're creating an obstacle, you have to circumvent. Try to get their support. But if you're just hitting a brick wall, then you have to do what you have to do to get better.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
If you're a Muslim counselor, like a psychologist or a social worker or whatnot, and your patient isn't Muslim, and the best thing for them to do isn't something that necessarily we believe in our religion, would it be bad to guide them with something that is morally right for them, but against our religion?
So just as I said, the way that you can kind of present options, instead of telling them, do this, you present options, this is what, these are the options that are typically presented. See, it's all about the way that you word things. So if you say that these are typically the options that are available, but this is what I would recommend, but these are also other, suggestions that have been put forward by psychologists. So by doing that, you're not encouraging them to do something that's against, Islamic teachings. You're sharing information. You're telling them a fact. These are the options that are usually presented to patients. I would recommend this, but it's up to you at the end of the day.
Any other questions? We have time for one more.
Make it a good one. Or make it an easy one, maybe that's a better question.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then I think we can wrap up now. So once again, to reiterate the points I've already made, we here at JSS have resources that are available to the entire community. Anytime you contact us, it is confidential, so we will not release your information. We will not contact anybody that you don't want us to contact. The information for JSS and to contact them will be on the screens. There's also Sister Saba sitting at the back. She is a counselor and she can help you out and you can ask her questions. You can take her card, or if you just want to talk to her right now, she will be sitting there at the back of the table for the duration of the program and after the program's finished. There is some food, so after Ziyarat, there's going to be some food at the back there, so you guys can grab that too. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the volunteers for helping set everything up. And thank you to Sheikh Nasser for your time. And can we please recite a loud salawat followed by Surah Al-Fatiha?